Blood under my fingernails tells the story of how Marcus Voss died and something else was born. 3 years ago, I wore the uniform of the 47th Cadian Shock Regiment with pride that could move mountains. Today, I write these words as a deserter, a traitor, a man who threw away everything sacred for the simple right to remain human. You think that makes me damned, but damnation found me long before I dropped my laser gun and fled. You haven't watched your own officers use you as bait. You haven't felt the weight of orders that require you to sacrifice everything good for tactical advantage measured in corpses. You haven't seen what happens when faith becomes just another weapon in the commissar's arsenal. They taught us that abandoning your brothers was the ultimate sin, but I've learned something that keeps me awake in the darkness. Sometimes the real betrayal is staying loyal to people who stopped being human. This is my warning. Chapter 1. The Loyal Son. The morning prayers echoed through Barracks Block 7 like they had every day for the past 3 years. "The Emperor protects," we chanted in unison, our voices bouncing off plasteel walls adorned with aquilas and purity seals. I mouthed the words with genuine faith then, believing every syllable that fell from my lips like drops of sacred oil. My name is Marcus Voss, and I was born to serve. Raised in the underhive of Cadia Prime, I knew from childhood that my destiny lay in the Imperial Guard. My father had died holding the Kasrian Gate against the 13th Black Crusade. My grandfather fell on the blood-soaked fields of Mordian 7. Military service wasn't just tradition in our family, it was divine calling. I remember the pride swelling in my chest as I received my first flak armor, the weight of it settling on my shoulders like the embrace of the Emperor himself. The fabric smelled of industrial cleaning chemicals and the faint ozone scent of blessed promethium. Sergeant Corvin, a grizzled veteran with a bionic eye and 3 campaign studs, inspected our formation with the intensity of a hunting predator. "You maggots think you're soldiers now." His voice carried the authority of someone who'd seen 100 worlds burn. "You're nothing but meat for the grinder until you prove otherwise. The Emperor's enemies won't care about your prayers or your purity. They'll care about your aim and your courage." Training on Cadia was brutal by design. The fortress world had been forging warriors for 10,000 years, and every tradition was written in blood and necessity. We spent 18 hours a day drilling, weapons practice, urban combat, artillery coordination, orbital drop procedures. The weak were weeded out quickly, either through injury, breakdown, or the quiet disappearance that meant a commissar had deemed them wanting. I excelled at marksmanship. My lace gun felt like an extension of my soul, every shot guided by faith and precision. During target practice, I could put 20 consecutive shots through the same hole at 300 meters. The other troopers called me Deadeye Voss, and I wore the nickname with honor. Accuracy meant survival, and survival meant serving the Emperor longer. The barracks were our universe for those months. 50 men crammed into a space designed for 30, sleeping in triple-bunked cots that reeked of sweat and fear dreams. We shared everything: rations, stories, fears we couldn't voice during daylight hours. Trooper Kellyan from the Mordian Iron Guard taught us how to clean our weapons with religious precision. Young Tobias from an agri-world showed us how to make ration bars taste almost edible with smuggled spices. Food was functional rather than pleasant. Grey protein paste, vitamin-fortified gruel, and synth meat that tasted like cardboard soaked in machinery oil. We ate standing at attention, 10 minutes precisely, 3 times daily. Hunger was considered weakness, and weakness was heresy. I learned to be grateful for every calorie, knowing millions across the galaxy had less. Our officers were products of the Schola Progenium, trained from birth to command and inspire through fear and faith. Lieutenant Castor had the bearing of someone who'd never doubted the righteousness of imperial doctrine. His uniform was always immaculate, his devotions performed with clockwork precision. He spoke of duty and honor like they were physical forces that could turn aside enemy fire. "Remember, troopers," he would say during evening briefings, "every shot you fire is a prayer. Every enemy you kill is an offering to the Golden Throne. Your life belongs to the Emperor, and through your service, his light reaches the darkest corners of the galaxy." The commissar attached to our regiment was a different creature entirely. Commissar Thorne moved through the barracks like death's shadow, his bolt pistol gleaming at his hip, his coat billowing with each measured step. He had pale skin stretched tight over angular bones and eyes like chips of winter ice. When he looked at you, it felt like he was calculating how much your death might serve as an example to others. We witnessed our first execution during week 8 of training. Trooper Hendricks from 3rd Platoon had been caught selling ammunition to underhive gangers. The crime was discovered during a surprise inspection, and justice was swift. Thorne made all 500 trainees watch as he placed his bolt pistol against Hendricks' skull and pulled the trigger. The sound echoed across the parade ground like thunder, and pieces of the traitor's head painted the Aquila mosaic behind him. "This is the price of betraying your oath," Thorne announced, his voice carrying clearly across the shocked silence. "Remember this moment when temptation whispers in your ear. The Emperor's justice is absolute." I felt sick watching Hendricks die, but I told myself it was righteous disgust at his treachery. Good soldiers shouldn't feel sympathy for traitors. The Emperor's enemies deserve no mercy, whether they wore enemy colors or imperial uniforms. That night, I prayed longer than usual, asking the Emperor to strengthen my resolve and purify my heart of weakness. Training culminated in the Iron Cross trials, a month-long exercise in the Cadian wastes where we faced live ammunition, actual explosives, and scenarios designed to break the weak-willed. Casualty rates typically ran 20%, but survivors earned the right to call themselves Imperial Guardsmen. We marched into the wasteland singing battle hymns, our voices strong with faith and determination. The trials tested everything we'd learned. We fought mock battles against servitor opponents programmed to kill. We survived on minimal rations while crossing radiation zones. We learned to sleep standing up, to eat while marching, to reload our weapons in complete darkness. Every challenge was designed to push us beyond human limitations through faith alone. I saved Tobias's life during the final exercise when his oxygen recycler failed in a toxic fog bank. I shared my own supply, carrying him 3 kilometers to safety while under simulated enemy fire. The medic said he would have died within minutes. That night, he swore a blood oath that he would stand by me no matter what battles lay ahead. Graduation day arrived with all the ceremony the Imperium could muster. We stood in perfect formation as servo skulls blessed our weapons with sacred oils. Regimental standards snapped in the wind, their golden aquilus catching the morning sun. I felt 10 feet tall in my dress uniform, every button polished to mirror brightness, every crease sharp enough to cut flesh. "You are no longer children of Cadia," Colonel Vasquez announced from the reviewing stand. "You are the sword arm of the Emperor, his chosen instruments of war. Where you march, his light follows. Where you fight, his enemies perish. Guard your faith as carefully as your ammunition, for both are precious beyond measure." We received our regimental assignments that evening. The 47th Cadian Shock Regiment was bound for the Sabbat Worlds, where a massive campaign was grinding through its 3rd year. Intelligence reported moderate resistance from local PDF forces and scattered chaos cultists. Command expected the deployment to last 18 months maximum. I wrote a letter home that night, my stylus trembling with excitement as I described our glorious assignment. My mother would be proud to hear her son was carrying the Emperor's justice to the galaxy's edge. I sealed the letter with a drop of my own blood and a prayer for victory. Looking back now, hiding in the ruins of a civilization I helped destroy, I can barely recognize the young man who wrote those words. Faith is a beautiful thing when it remains untested. It shines like polished gold in the safety of parade grounds and training exercises. But faith, I learned, is also fragile. It can shatter against the rocks of reality, leaving only sharp fragments that cut the soul. The transport ships would arrive within the week to carry us to war. None of us knew we were marching toward damnation itself. Chapter 2. First Blood. The transport ship. Emperor's Wrath smelled like a tomb filled with unwashed bodies and recycled fear. 3,000 guardsmen packed into cargo holds designed for heavy machinery, breathing the same stale air for 6 weeks while traveling through the warp's nightmare realm. The ship's Geller field flickered periodically, and during those moments, we could hear things scratching at the hull from outside reality. I tried to maintain training discipline during the journey. Every morning at 0600 ship time, I performed my devotions alongside Tobias and the rest of Second Squad. We cleaned our weapons religiously, checked our equipment, and rehearsed tactical procedures until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. The alternative was thinking too hard about what waited for us in the Sabbat worlds. Trooper Cadian had served 2 previous campaigns and shared stories during the endless hours between meals. He told us about the siege of Herodor, where the regiment held a trench line for 6 months against continuous artillery bombardment. He described night raids on chaos positions, where you could smell the corruption on enemy soldiers before you saw them. His words painted warfare as terrible but glorious, a crucible where ordinary men became legends. "The first time you kill someone, it changes you," he said one evening, his voice barely audible over the ship's mechanical humming. "Not because killing is wrong, the Emperor's enemies deserve death, but because you realize how easy it is, how fragile life becomes when faith and fury meet flesh and bone." The ship's commissar, a thin woman named Valdris, conducted random loyalty inspections throughout the journey. She would appear without warning in the cargo holds, selecting troopers for private questioning about their faith, their commitment, their willingness to die for the Emperor. Those conversations always ended the same way, with the selected soldier swearing fresh oaths of loyalty while staring down the barrel of her bolt pistol. I was selected twice during the journey. Both times, I answered her questions with the fervor of genuine belief. I spoke about my family's military tradition, my desire to serve the Emperor, my willingness to die before dishonoring my regiment. Valdris listened with cold attention, her pale eyes searching for cracks in my devotion, like a tech priest examining machinery for flaws. "Faith without testing is meaningless, trooper," she told me during our second interview. "Soon you will face the Emperor's enemies in battle. Remember that every moment of doubt weakens not just yourself, but every soldier who depends on you. Doubt is the gateway to heresy, and heresy is the gateway to damnation." The ship translated back to real space above Cadia, with a violence that sent half the regiment to their knees. Reality reasserted itself like a physical blow, gravity shifting in ways that made our stomachs revolt. Through the few portholes available to enlisted men, we caught our first glimpse of the Sabbat worlds, a cluster of systems burning with the light of distant warfare. Cadia itself appeared as a brown and green marble suspended against the void, its surface scarred by impact craters and the geometric patterns of defensive fortifications. Orbital platforms surrounded the planet like metallic moons, their weapon batteries trained on the shipping lanes below. This was supposed to be a secure staging area, our intelligence briefings had assured us. The sight of those defensive positions suggested otherwise. We made planetfall in waves, our Valkyrie transports screaming through atmosphere thick with industrial smoke and weapons discharge. The pilot of our transport was a veteran named Santos, who chewed low sticks constantly and flew like he was personally insulted by gravity. His aircraft bucked and weaved through air traffic so dense it looked like a metal storm. "Welcome to the Sabbat worlds, boys," Santos called back over the engine noise. "Hope you brought your dancing shoes, because this party's been going on for 3 years and shows no signs of stopping." Cadia's primary spaceport was a sprawling complex of landing pads, cargo warehouses, and defensive bunkers stretching to the horizon. The air tasted of promethium fumes and ozone, with an underlying chemical tang that made your teeth ache. Supply convoys rumbled between landing zones in endless streams, carrying ammunition, food, equipment, and body bags in equal measure. Our first assignment was garrison duty at Firebase Taurus, a fortified position overlooking the primary supply route between the spaceport and forward operating bases. The firebase consisted of prefabricated bunkers, weapon emplacements, and living quarters that looked like they'd been assembled by people who'd never heard of comfort. Everything was painted in regulation colors: grey for walls, brown for equipment, red for areas where unauthorized personnel would be shot on sight. The commanding officer was Captain Mordian, a career soldier whose face looked like it had been carved from granite by someone with limited artistic skills. He addressed our regiment on the parade ground, surrounded by sandbags and razor wire, his voice competing with the distant rumble of artillery fire. "Gentlemen, welcome to the real war," he began, his words cutting through the humid air like lass fire. "For 3 years, this system has been contested by forces hostile to imperial rule. Traitor PDF units, separatist militias, and worse things that intelligence won't discuss in polite company. Your job is simple: hold this position, protect the supply lines, and kill anything that threatens imperial interests." Our squad was assigned to Bunker 7, a reinforced position mounting a heavy bolter and overlooking a valley that funneled traffic toward the main base. The bunker smelled like machine oil and previous occupants' fear sweat, its walls decorated with graffiti left by earlier garrison units. Names, dates, prayer fragments, and tally marks counting days until rotation home. Tobias found a message scratched into the concrete near his sleeping alcove. "The Emperor protects those who protect themselves. Trust no one. Watch the shadows." Trooper Valdez, 23rd Mordian, KIA, 4001, 27, 941-41. The date was less than 2 weeks old. Our daily routine established itself quickly. 4-hour watches manning the heavy bolter position, 4 hours of equipment maintenance, 4 hours of sleep if we were lucky. The landscape beyond our bunker was a hellscape of shell craters, abandoned vehicles, and vegetation that had learned to grow in ground poisoned by chemical weapons. Nothing moved during daylight hours except supply convoys and the occasional patrol. The first sign that our intelligence briefings had been optimistic came during my 3rd night watch. I was scanning the valley floor through night vision goggles when movement caught my attention near a destroyed Lehman Russ tank. At first, I thought it might be local wildlife or shifting debris. Then I saw the deliberate way the shadows moved, flowing around cover points with tactical precision. I called for Sergeant Corvin immediately. He joined me at the observation post, his own goggles tracking the movement I'd identified. For 10 minutes, we watched as shapes moved through the darkness with obvious military training. They wore no uniforms we could identify and carried weapons that didn't match imperial patterns. "Scouts," Corvin whispered, his voice tight with tension. "Probably marking our positions for artillery targeting or planning an assault route. Count at least 8, possibly more in the dead ground to the east." We followed protocol, reporting the contact to command and maintaining observation without engaging. The standing orders were clear: do not initiate contact unless directly threatened. Preserve operational security. Gather intelligence on enemy capabilities and intentions. It felt like cowardice, watching potential enemies study our defenses while we did nothing to stop them. The shapes vanished before dawn, fading into the landscape like they'd never existed. Command dismissed our report as possible enemy reconnaissance and reminded us that rules of engagement remained unchanged. No confirmation of hostile intent meant no authorization to fire. 2 days later, the 23rd Mordian Patrol failed to return from their scheduled reconnaissance sweep. Search teams found their vehicles destroyed by improvised explosive devices and their bodies arranged in positions clearly meant to send a message. The enemy had removed their eyes and tongues, leaving them to die slowly while staring sightlessly at the sky. That night, Firebase Taurus went to full alert status. Floodlights bathed the perimeter in harsh white radiance, while machine gun teams swept the approaches with overlapping fields of fire. The Commissar made rounds to each position, reminding everyone that dying in battle was preferable to dying in disgrace. I lay in my bunk, listening to Tobias breathe in the darkness, his sleep troubled by dreams he couldn't remember but wouldn't forget. Outside, automated sentry guns tracked shadows that might have been threats or might have been phantoms. The war had found us at last, and I discovered that all my training had failed to prepare me for the weight of watching friends die for causes I didn't understand. The real fighting would begin tomorrow. Command had authorized patrols into the contested zone, seeking contact with enemy forces that preferred shadows to open battle. We would carry the Emperor's light into darkness, as we'd been trained to do. I spent that last peaceful night cleaning my lasgun one final time, running consecrated oils along its barrel while whispering prayers my mother had taught me as a child. The weapon felt heavier than usual, weighted with responsibility I wasn't sure I was ready to carry. Faith, I was about to learn, becomes complicated when people start shooting back. Chapter 3. The enemy revealed dawn came to Firebase Taurus with the sound of incoming artillery. The first shells struck the motor pool at 05:47 hours, turning 3 Chimera transports into twisted metal sculptures that screamed with the voices of burning promethium. I woke to alarms blaring and Sergeant Corvin shouting orders that competed with explosions for our attention. Contact front, all squads to defensive positions. This is not a drill. I rolled from my bunk with practiced efficiency, muscle memory taking over while my brain struggled to process the reality of actual combat. Flak armor, helmet, weapons, ammunition, the ritual of preparation I'd performed thousands of times in training. But training had never included the earth-shaking impact of high-explosive shells or the metallic taste of adrenaline coating my tongue like liquid fear. Tobias moved beside me with mechanical precision, his face pale but determined as we gathered our equipment. Around us, the bunker filled with controlled chaos as 30 soldiers transformed themselves from sleeping men into instruments of war. The air grew thick with sweat, oil, and the ozone scent of activated power packs. "Voss, Cadian, man the heavy bolter!" Corvin's voice cut through the noise like a chain sword through flesh. "Tobias, Garrett, ammunition detail. Everyone else, defensive positions and prepare for ground assault." The heavy bolter position offered an excellent view of the valley floor, which was why it was also the position most likely to attract enemy fire. I slid behind the weapon's bulk, feeling its weight and potential like a familiar tool. Cadian fed ammunition belts while I traversed the barrel across our assigned sector, searching for targets that hadn't revealed themselves yet. The artillery barrage lasted exactly 7 minutes, dropping high explosive rounds in a pattern designed to destroy specific targets rather than carpet bomb the entire firebase. Someone had studied our defenses carefully, identifying fuel dumps, communications equipment, and command bunkers with surgical precision. This wasn't random violence, it was professional military action executed by trained soldiers. "Movement, Sector 7! Tobias called from his observation post, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Infantry advancing through the crater field, approximately 200 meters. I swung the heavy bolter toward the indicated area, activating the weapons machine spirit with prayers I'd memorized during training. The targeting scope revealed figures moving with tactical discipline between shell holes and debris, their equipment and formations clearly military rather than militia. These weren't rebels or cultists, they were soldiers, but they weren't wearing uniforms I recognized from Imperial Guard manuals. Their armor was dark green with brown camouflage patterns, and their weapons appeared to be locally manufactured rather than standard pattern LAS weapons. Most disturbing were the symbols painted on their helmets, 8-pointed stars that made my skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. "Chaos forces confirmed," I reported, my finger finding the firing stud as muscle memory and training overrode conscious thought. "Engaging enemy infantry, me." The heavy bolter roared to life with a sound like the Emperor's own anger-given voice. Mass-reactive bolts tore through the morning air, each round guided by faith and fury toward enemies of mankind. I watched through the scope as my shots found their marks, sending traitor soldiers spinning into death with satisfying precision. Return fire came immediately. Las bolts and solid projectiles sparked off our bunker's armor plating while heavier weapons sought our firing ports with deadly accuracy. A rocket-propelled grenade struck the wall 3 meters from my position, filling the air with concrete dust and the sharp smell of chemical explosives. "Cadian, ammunition!" I shouted, not taking my eyes from the targeting scope. The enemy advance was faltering under our fire, but more shapes moved in the dead ground beyond our visual range. This was only the first wave. The battle developed into a deadly rhythm. Enemy forces would advance under covering fire, seeking to close distance with our defensive positions. We would engage with everything available: heavy bolters, lass rifles, grenade launchers, and the occasional autocannon round from the firebase's main armament. Bodies fell on both sides, but the mathematics of defensive warfare favored the defenders as long as ammunition held out. I lost count of how many enemy soldiers I killed during that first engagement. The heavy bolter made personal marksmanship irrelevant. It was area denial through overwhelming firepower, each burst capable of cutting multiple targets in half. But every traitor I killed seemed to be replaced by two more, emerging from positions we hadn't identified during our reconnaissance. "Second wave incoming!" someone shouted from across the bunker. "Armor support, bearing 270. Through the smoke and dust, I could see tracked vehicles advancing across the valley floor. They looked like Lehman Russ tanks, but wrong somehow, bristling with additional armor plating and weapons that didn't match Imperial specifications. Worse, they bore the same 8-pointed star symbols I'd seen on enemy infantry, painted in colors that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. Captain Mordian's voice crackled over the Vox system, his words barely audible through static and interference. "All call signs. Enemy armor confirmed in sectors 5 through 9. Lascanon teams engage at maximum range. Artillery support requested but unavailable due to communications disruption." The corrupted tanks opened fire with weapons that screamed rather than roared. Energy beams that looked like liquid darkness carved through our defensive positions, melting plasteel armor like wax before flame. Where those beams struck, the very air seemed to corrupt, leaving behind patches of reality that hurt to look at directly. Trooper Garrett was manning a Lascanon position when one of those dark beams found him. I watched in horror as his body didn't just die. It changed, flesh flowing like water, while bones grew in impossible directions. He was still screaming when Commissar Valdris put a bolt round through his skull, ending his suffering and preventing whatever he was becoming from fully manifesting. "Hold your positions," Valdris commanded, her bolt pistol smoking in her hand. "The Emperor protects the faithful. These are merely tests of our devotion." But faith felt inadequate against enemies who could corrupt reality itself. The defensive battle continued for another hour, our ammunition running low while enemy forces maintained pressure from multiple directions. Several bunkers had gone silent, their Vox channels filled with static that sounded almost like distant screaming. I was changing ammunition belts when I saw him, a figure standing among the enemy forces who didn't move like the others. He was tall, unnaturally so, wearing armor that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Even at distance, I could feel his attention like a physical weight when his gaze swept across our positions. "Cadian," I whispered, not trusting my voice to remain steady. "Look at the enemy command position, bearing 285. Tell me what you see." Cadian pressed his face against the observation scope, his breathing becoming labored as he focused on the target I'd indicated. After a moment, he pulled back with his face pale and his hands trembling. "That's not human," he said quietly. "I've seen corrupted PDF officers before, but that thing, it's something else wearing human shape." The unnaturally tall figure raised what might have been a staff or weapon, pointing it directly at our bunker across hundreds of meters of contested ground. I felt his attention focus on me like the weight of a falling building, pressing against my mind with alien intelligence that made my teeth ache. Then the world exploded in purple fire. I don't remember the next few minutes clearly. There was pain beyond description, light that burned through closed eyelids, and sounds that bypassed my ears to vibrate directly in my bones. When consciousness returned, half our bunker had been reduced to molten slag, and the air tasted of copper and burnt offerings. Tobias was dead, his body cut in half by falling debris. Cadian survived, but with burns that would mark him for life, assuming he lived long enough for scars to matter. Sergeant Corvin was calling for medical evacuation over Vox channels that responded only with static. The enemy assault had broken against our defenses, but at terrible cost. Across the firebase, damaged bunkers leaked smoke into air that shimmered with unnatural heat. Bodies in Imperial uniform lay scattered among defensive positions that would never be fully manned again. But we had learned something crucial during that first battle. The enemy wasn't just traitor PDF forces or separatist militias. They were something far worse: Chaos Space Marines and their corrupted human auxiliaries, armed with weapons that violated the laws of physics and motivated by hatred older than human civilization. That night, as medical teams worked to extract wounded soldiers from collapsed positions, I helped carry Tobias's body to the temporary morgue. His face was peaceful in death, free from the fear and pain that had marked his final moments. I closed his eyes with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and whispered the prayers for the dead my mother had taught me. Commissar Valdris found me there among the casualties, her pale features unreadable in the dim light from glow globes. She studied my face for a long moment before speaking. "Your first taste of real war, trooper. How does it compare to your expectations?" I thought about lying, giving her the answer military doctrine demanded. But exhaustion and grief made honesty easier than deception. "It's worse than I imagined, Mom. The enemy, they're not what we were told to expect." She nodded slowly, her expression neither approving nor disapproving. Intelligence briefings rarely capture the full horror of chaos corruption. These enemies don't just want to kill us, trooper. They want to damn us. Remember that difference when the real fighting begins. Real fighting. As if what we'd just survived was merely a warm-up exercise. I spent the rest of that night on watch duty, staring out at a landscape littered with the dead while trying to understand how war had become something beyond my worst nightmares. The enemy was still out there in the darkness, probably planning their next assault. And somewhere among them was that unnatural figure whose attention had felt like damnation itself. Faith had carried me through training and transport to this moment. But faith, I was beginning to understand, might not be enough to carry me home. Chapter 4: Maximum Violence. The counterattack order came down at 0300 hours, delivered by a staff officer whose uniform was too clean and whose hands had never held a weapon in anger. Lieutenant Castor gathered our depleted squad around a holo display showing terrain we'd never seen, marked with enemy positions identified by intelligence sources nobody would name. "Operation Cleansing Fire commences at dawn," Castor announced, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never watched friends die. 3rd Battalion will advance through sectors 12 and 13, eliminating enemy strongpoints and establishing forward observation posts for artillery targeting. I stared at the tactical display, trying to reconcile the neat symbols and grid coordinates with the reality of dark beam weapons and enemies who could corrupt flesh with their gaze. The hologram showed a straightforward infantry assault against prepared positions, exactly the kind of operation that had been filling graveyards for 10,000 years. "Sir," Sergeant Corvin spoke carefully, "what's our intelligence assessment of enemy capabilities? Yesterday's defensive action revealed weapons and tactics not covered in standard briefings." The staff officer's expression flickered with annoyance at being questioned by enlisted personnel. "Enemy forces are assessed as traitor PDF with limited heavy equipment support. Command anticipates moderate resistance lasting no more than 6 hours. Moderate resistance. I thought about the unnatural figure who destroyed half our bunker with purple fire, about Trooper Garrett's body changing into something that required execution rather than medical attention. Command's assessment suggested they were fighting a completely different war than the one we'd experienced. The pre-assault briefing continued with discussions of ammunition loads, casualty evacuation procedures, and communication protocols. Everything proceeded according to doctrine, as if doctrine meant anything against enemies who could violate the basic laws of reality. I found myself checking my equipment with obsessive precision, knowing that ritual was all that stood between me and panic. My lasgun felt heavier than usual as I performed the final blessing ritual, running consecrated oils along its barrel while whispering prayers that seemed inadequate for what lay ahead. The weapon had served faithfully during the defensive battle, its machine spirit responding to my commands with mechanical precision. But precision meant nothing against armor that absorbed energy and flesh that transformed under alien influence. Kellyan had been transferred to a medical facility, his burns too severe for field duty. His replacement was a young trooper named Davidson, who'd arrived on the last transport from Cadia. Davidson had the eager enthusiasm of someone whose understanding of war came from training manuals and propaganda broadcasts. I envied him his ignorance while dreading his inevitable education. We formed up in the pre-dawn darkness, 300 soldiers arranged in assault formation across terrain that had been peaceful farmland before the war arrived. The landscape bore scars of previous battles, shell craters, burned-out vehicles, and patches of ground that reflected starlight in ways that made your eyes water. The artillery preparation began at 05:45 hours, Earthshaker cannons and mortars dropping high-explosive rounds on suspected enemy positions. The bombardment lasted 20 minutes, filling the air with thunder and the chemical smell of explosives. But I noticed that some target areas seemed unaffected by the barrage, as if the shells were being absorbed or deflected by forces beyond conventional physics. "Fix bayonets!" The order passed down the line like a prayer of steel and fury. 200 blades caught the morning light as they locked into position, transforming ranged weapons into instruments of close combat. The sound was almost musical, metal singing against metal in harmony older than the Imperium itself. Lieutenant Castor raised his chainsword above his head, its motor growling with barely contained violence. Around him, squad leaders checked their chronometers and waited for the signal that would send us across ground designed to kill anyone brave enough or foolish enough to cross it. "For the Emperor!" Castor's voice cut through the morning air like a battle hymn given form. "For the Emperor!" 300 voices responded, our battle cry echoing across a landscape that would remember our names or forget them entirely within the next few hours. The advance began with textbook precision. First wave advancing under covering fire, second wave following at 50-meter intervals, support weapons moving to overwatch positions that could provide enfilading fire against enemy positions. Everything proceeded according to doctrine, because doctrine was all we had. I moved forward with Davidson beside me, both of us maintaining proper spacing while scanning for targets that might reveal themselves as we closed distance. The ground beneath our feet was soft from recent rains, sucking at our boots with each step. The air smelled of cordite and something else, a sweet, cloying scent that made my stomach turn without obvious cause. Enemy fire began at 400 meters, las bolts and projectile rounds, seeking targets among our advancing formations. The fire was disciplined and accurate, coming from prepared positions that had survived our artillery preparation intact. But it was conventional weapons fire, the kind of resistance we'd trained to overcome through fire and movement. "Contact front!" Davidson shouted, dropping to one knee and returning fire with his laser gun. "Enemy infantry, grid reference!" His words were cut off by a sound like reality tearing apart. The same purple fire I'd seen during the defensive battle erupted from concealed positions, carving through our formation with energy that transformed everything it touched. Soldiers didn't just die, they changed, their bodies becoming things that required immediate execution to prevent further corruption. I saw Trooper Martinez from 1st Squad catch a glancing blow from one of those beams. His left arm transformed into something with too many joints and fingers that ended in bone spurs sharp enough to cut steel. He was still screaming when Commissar Valdris put a bolt round through his chest, ending his agony before it could spread to the rest of his body. "Advance! Advance!" Castor commanded, his chainsword roaring as he cut down something that had once been human, but no longer qualified for the description. "The Emperor protects the faithful!" But faith felt inadequate against enemies who could rewrite the fundamental nature of matter with their weapons. The advance continued, because stopping meant dying in place. But every meter forward carried us deeper into a nightmare that military training had never prepared us for. Davidson lasted another 50 meters before enemy fire found him. A las bolt took him in the chest, punching through his flak armor like it was tissue paper. He fell backward with his eyes wide with surprise, blood frothing from his lips as he tried to speak words that would never come. I knelt beside him, trying to apply pressure to wounds that were clearly fatal. His hand grabbed my wrist with surprising strength, pulling me close enough to hear his whispered words. Tell my mother. Tell her I died well." He was gone before I could respond, his eyes losing focus as whatever had made him human departed for whatever waited beyond. I closed his eyes with hands that had stopped trembling, my emotions shifting from grief to anger to something colder and more useful. The assault continued without pause for individual casualties. We had objectives to secure and enemies to eliminate, regardless of personal cost. That was the mathematics of warfare, lives spent like ammunition to achieve strategic goals that mattered more than any individual soldier's survival. I advanced with the rest of the formation, my laser guns spitting coherent light at targets that appeared and disappeared among defensive positions that shouldn't have existed. Some enemies died like normal humans. Others required multiple hits to stop moving, their bodies refusing to acknowledge lethal damage until massive trauma finally convinced them to cease functioning. The worst were the ones who kept fighting after death. Corpses animated by malevolent will, empty eye sockets weeping fluids that corroded whatever they touched. Sergeant Corvin put 3 las bolts through one enemy soldier's center mass before resorting to his entrenching tool, literally chopping the thing into pieces too small to maintain cohesion. "This isn't warfare," I heard him mutter as he cleaned corrupted blood from his makeshift weapon. "This is extermination." We reached the primary objective at 0847 hours, a fortified position that intelligence had identified as an enemy command post. What we found was a structure that hurt to look at directly, its walls built from materials that couldn't exist according to any scientific principles I understood. The air around it shimmered with heat that had nothing to do with temperature. Lieutenant Castor organized the assault with the same methodical precision he'd shown during training exercises, covering fire, grenade preparation, coordination between squad elements. Everything by the book, as if the book had any relevance to what we were facing. The explosion that ended the assault came without warning, not from enemy weapons, but from something inside the structure itself, a detonation that released energy in colors that had no names. The blast wave picked up soldiers and flung them hundreds of meters, their bodies broken by forces that operated outside normal physics. I found myself lying in a crater that hadn't existed moments before. My armor cracked and my weapons scattered in pieces around me. Blood ran from my nose and ears, and my vision kept shifting between normal sight and something that showed the world in impossible geometries. The assault had succeeded in tactical terms. The enemy position was eliminated, our objectives secured, the immediate threat neutralized. But success felt hollow when achieved at the cost of everything that made victory meaningful. Of the 300 soldiers who'd begun the assault, fewer than 50 remained capable of continued combat. The rest were dead, wounded, or transformed into things that required immediate execution. The enemy body count was impossible to determine, because many of their casualties had simply dissolved when exposed to concentrated las fire. That evening, as medical teams worked to stabilize the wounded and chaplains performed last rites for the dead, I sat among the survivors, trying to understand what we'd accomplished. The tactical objective was secure, but the cost had been everything that mattered. Friends, faith, and the comfortable certainty that we were fighting for something worth the sacrifice. Commissar Valdris found me there, her uniform stained with blood that might have been human. She studied my face for a long moment before speaking. "You're beginning to understand, aren't you, trooper? This isn't the war they taught you to expect." I looked up at her, seeing my own doubts reflected in her pale eyes. "What are we really fighting, Mom?" Her smile was cold as winter on a dead world. "Damnation itself, trooper, and we're losing, yeah?" Chapter 5. The Dark Bargain. 3 weeks after the assault, Firebase Taurus had become a charnel house disguised as a military installation. The wounded outnumbered the combat effective by 2 to 1. Medical supplies had dwindled to bandages and prayer, and every night brought reports of soldiers who'd simply vanished from their posts without explanation or trace. I found myself assigned to night patrol duty, walking the perimeter with 5 other survivors while trying to pretend that the darkness beyond our floodlights contained ordinary enemies. The shadows moved wrong in this place, flowing uphill and pooling in areas where mathematics said they couldn't exist. Sometimes you could hear whispers in languages that predated human speech. My patrol partner was Trooper Chen, a veteran of the Mordian Iron Guard, whose left arm had been replaced with a crude bionic after the counter-assault. The replacement limb functioned adequately but lacked sensation, forcing him to watch his artificial hand constantly to ensure it performed required tasks. He'd developed the habit of talking to the mechanical fingers as if they were pets that required encouragement. "Contact shouldn't be this quiet," Chen muttered as we walked the northeastern sector, our boots crunching on gravel that sparkled with embedded shrapnel. 3 weeks without major enemy action means they're planning something big. I nodded agreement, though part of me welcomed the respite from violence that transformed soldiers into ammunition for incomprehensible weapons. The quiet gave us time to process what we'd experienced, to try understanding how warfare had become something beyond human comprehension. But the quiet also brought other problems. Without the immediate threat of combat to focus on, soldiers had time to think about what they'd seen and done. Some broke completely, requiring restraint and sedation until transport could evacuate them to facilities equipped for mental rehabilitation. Others simply stopped functioning, performing duties with mechanical precision, while their minds retreated to places where purple fire couldn't reach. The worst were the ones who started asking questions. "Voss," Chen said suddenly, stopping our patrol near a section of fence that had been repaired multiple times. "What do you think we're really accomplishing here?" The question hung in the air like cordite smoke, heavy with implications that doctrine couldn't address. I thought about Davidson's final words, about Tobias dying for objectives that command couldn't adequately explain, about enemies who violated the basic laws of reality. "We're serving the Emperor," I replied automatically, the response drilled into my mind through years of training and indoctrination. Chen's bionic hand clenched into a fist, servos whining with mechanical distress. "Are we? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like we're feeding men into a meat grinder that runs on faith and produces nothing but corpses." Before I could respond, the vox bead in my ear crackled with Sergeant Corvin's voice. "All patrol units, return to base immediately. We have a situation in Bunker 4. We found Bunker 4's interior painted with blood that reflected light in patterns that hurt to examine closely. 3 soldiers lay dead in positions that suggested they'd been killed by someone they trusted enough to let close. But their wounds were made by weapons we didn't recognize. Energy burns that had cauterized flesh while somehow keeping the victims alive long enough to experience maximum agony. The 4th member of the bunker's crew was missing entirely. Trooper Valdez had simply vanished, leaving behind only his equipment and a message scratched into the concrete wall. "The truth is in the darkness. Embrace it and live. Resist it and suffer." Commissar Valdez examined the scene with professional detachment, her bolt pistol drawn but not quite aimed at anyone specific. She studied the blood patterns, the weapon signatures, the message that proclaimed heresy in letters carved deep enough to suggest inhuman strength. "Corruption," she announced finally. "Valdez has been turned by enemy influence, probably through exposure to warp-tainted materials during the counter-assault. He's become a threat to unit cohesion and imperial doctrine." But I remembered Valdez from training. He'd been a quiet soldier who wrote letters to his sister every week and kept a small shrine to the Emperor in his personal footlocker. Whatever had killed his squad mates wasn't the man I'd known. "Mom," I said carefully, "what if the enemy has weapons we don't understand? Technologies that can affect human behavior, or are you questioning Imperial intelligence assessments, Trooper?" Valdez's voice carried the weight of 1,000 bolt shells. "Or perhaps suggesting that our doctrine is inadequate for current conditions?" The smart answer was immediate denial, complete agreement with official explanations that made sense within established parameters. But exhaustion and grief had eroded my ability to pretend that comfortable lies were more valuable than uncomfortable truths. "I'm suggesting that we're fighting something beyond our experience," I said quietly, "and that continuing to pretend otherwise will get everyone killed." The silence that followed felt dense enough to cut with a chainsword. Around us, the other survivors watched with expressions that revealed their own doubts, their own questions about orders that defied common sense, and enemies that violated natural law. Valdris studied my face for a long moment, her pale eyes searching for signs of corruption or heresy. When she spoke, her voice was softer than usual, almost human. "Walk with me, trooper." We left the blood-stained bunker and walked toward the perimeter, passing guard posts manned by soldiers whose eyes had seen too much and whose faith had been tested beyond its breaking point. The night air carried sounds that might have been wind or might have been distant screaming. "How long have you served the Imperium, Voss?" Valdris asked as we reached an observation post overlooking the valley where so many had died. 3 years of training, 3 months of active service, ma'am. And in that time, have you ever questioned whether the Emperor's will was being faithfully executed by those who claim to serve him? The question was a trap, obviously. Commissars were trained to identify and eliminate heretical thoughts before they could metastasize into actual treason. But something in her tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than professional interrogation. "I've wondered about the wisdom of specific orders," I admitted, "but never about serving the Emperor himself." Valdris nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the darkness beyond our floodlights. "What if I told you that some of us have been asking the same questions? That there are those within the Commissariat who believe current doctrine is inadequate for the threats we're facing?" I stared at her, trying to process the implications of what she was suggesting. Commissars who questioned doctrine were either heretics or revolutionaries, and both categories typically ended with execution. "I would ask what alternatives you're considering," I said carefully. Her smile was neither warm nor cold, but something else entirely. "There are forces in this galaxy older and more powerful than the Imperium. Forces that have offered knowledge and strength to those wise enough to accept their gifts. What if survival required embracing truths that contradict everything you've been taught?" The words hung between us like forbidden fruit, beautiful and poisonous in equal measure. Part of me recoiled from the obvious heresy, while another part whispered that heresy might be preferable to extinction. "You're talking about chaos," I said, the word tasting like ashes in my mouth. "I'm talking about survival," Valdris replied. "About power sufficient to protect those under our command. About knowledge that could end this war instead of prolonging it indefinitely." She reached into her coat and withdrew a small object that looked like crystallized darkness. The artifact hurt to look at directly, but somehow conveyed the impression of vast intelligence and unlimited potential. "This was recovered from the enemy command post you helped destroy. Our tech priests declared it heretical and ordered its destruction. But some of us recognized its true nature, a key to understanding forces that could make us equals rather than victims." I found myself staring at the artifact despite every instinct screaming warnings about corruption and damnation. The thing seemed to pulse with malevolent life, projecting emotions and images directly into my mind without passing through normal sensory channels. Knowledge, power, the ability to protect friends instead of watching them die. An end to feeling helpless against enemies who treated reality as a suggestion rather than a law. "What would accepting this knowledge cost?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "Everything you've been taught to believe," Valdris said softly. "But in exchange, you'd gain everything you've always wanted. The power to matter, to make a difference, to save the people you care about." I thought about Tobias dying under falling concrete, about Davidson bleeding out with words of love for a mother he'd never see again, about all the soldiers who'd followed orders that led them into meat grinders disguised as tactical objectives. "How many others have you approached with this offer?" "Enough," she said. "More than you might expect. Faith is a beautiful thing, trooper, but it's also fragile. When reality consistently contradicts belief, intelligent people begin questioning which one deserves their loyalty." The artifact seemed to pulse more rapidly, as if sensing my internal conflict and responding to emotional turbulence. Images flashed through my mind, visions of power sufficient to end suffering, knowledge that could transform weakness into strength, purpose that transcended blind obedience to distant authority. But I also remembered my mother's prayers, my father's sacrifice, the certainty that had carried me through training and into battle. Faith might be fragile, but it was also the foundation of everything that made resistance meaningful. "I need time to consider this," I said finally. Valdris nodded, making the artifact disappear back into her coat. "Time is something we have very little of, Trooper. The enemy is preparing another assault, and when it comes, only those with adequate power will survive. Faith alone has proven insufficient." She turned to walk back toward the command bunker, then paused and looked back at me. "You have until dawn to decide. After that, the offer expires, and you'll face what's coming with nothing but prayer and standard issue equipment." I stood alone on the perimeter, staring out at darkness that held enemies whose existence challenged everything I'd been taught about the nature of reality. Behind me, Firebase Taurus continued its slow transformation from military installation to tomb, each day bringing fresh evidence that we were losing a war we'd never understood. The choice before me was simple in its complexity: embrace heresy and gain power, or maintain faith and watch everyone die. Dawn was still hours away, but already I could feel the weight of decision pressing against my soul like a physical force. Chapter 6. The Willing Change. I made my decision during the pre-dawn watch, staring at the horizon where enemy forces gathered for what intelligence assured us would be their final assault. The mathematics were simple: 300 enemy soldiers armed with reality-warping weapons against 50 Imperial Guardsmen whose faith had been ground down to stubble by 3 months of impossible warfare. Faith alone wouldn't save us, but maybe damnation could. I found Commissar Valdris in the command bunker, reviewing tactical displays that showed enemy positions clustered around our perimeter, like infections around a wound. She looked up when I entered, her pale eyes reading the decision in my face before I spoke a word. "I'm ready to listen," I said quietly. She dismissed the other staff members with a gesture, waiting until we were alone before withdrawing the crystalline artifact from her coat. In the bunker's artificial light, the thing seemed to absorb illumination while somehow remaining visible, its surface reflecting depths that shouldn't have been possible in something so small. "Knowledge always comes with a price," Valdris said, placing the artifact on the tactical display where it cast shadows in directions that defied geometry. "What you're about to learn will change everything you believe about the nature of power, purpose, and possibility." I reached toward the crystal, my hand trembling with anticipation and terror. The moment my fingers made contact, reality exploded into sensation beyond human capacity to process. Images flooded my mind like water through a broken dam. Visions of the galaxy as it truly was, not the sterile propaganda version fed to Imperial citizens, but a realm where impossible beings fought wars that spanned millennia. I saw the Emperor not as a benevolent god figure, but as one player in a cosmic game whose rules were written in suffering and whose victory conditions required infinite sacrifice. The Chaos Gods revealed themselves not as malevolent destroyers, but as forces of change and growth that offered evolution beyond human limitations. Khorne promised strength to protect those who mattered. Tsench offered knowledge to understand and manipulate reality. Nurgle provided endurance to survive any hardship. Slaanesh granted perfection in all endeavors. And beneath them all, a vast intelligence that whispered truths about the universe's fundamental nature. That stagnation was death, that growth required change, that humanity's destiny lay not in blind obedience, but in willing transformation. The visions lasted subjective hours while occupying objective seconds. When awareness returned to the bunker, I found myself kneeling beside the tactical display, with tears streaming down my face and knowledge burning in my mind like holy fire. "Now you understand," Valdris said softly. "The enemy isn't trying to destroy us. They're trying to free us from chains we've worn so long we've forgotten they exist." I looked at her with eyes that could now see the subtle marks of change already present in her flesh. Her pale skin carried patterns of scarification, that formed symbols I suddenly recognized, and her eyes held depths that spoke of communion with forces beyond mortal comprehension. "How long have you been?" I struggled to find words for what she'd become. 6 months, she replied. "Since the first reports of enemy activity in this sector, Command sent me to investigate potential corruption among the local forces. Instead, I discovered that corruption was just another word for evolution." She gestured to the tactical display, where enemy positions now revealed their true nature to my enhanced perception. What I'd seen as random deployments were actually precise geometric patterns designed to channel warp energy through physical space. The coming assault wasn't meant to destroy Firebase Taurus. It was meant to complete a ritual that would transform every survivor into something greater than human. "The soldiers we've been fighting," I said, understanding flooding through me like revelation. "They're not traitors. They're former Imperial forces who've accepted the same gift you're offering me." "Some of them," Valdris confirmed. "Others are local PDF who realized that independence from Imperial rule required power the Emperor couldn't provide. A few are genuine Chaos Space Marines, but most are ordinary humans who've chosen evolution over extinction." I thought about the enemy soldiers I'd killed during the counter-assault, how some had fought with tactical precision that matched Imperial training. They hadn't been motivated by hatred of humanity. They'd been trying to offer the same transformation that now burned in my own mind. "What about the others here? The rest of the garrison?" "Some will accept the gift when it's offered," Valdris said. "Others will resist and require persuasion. A few will need to be eliminated for the greater good. Change is rarely bloodless, but it's always necessary." The knowledge granted by the artifact included understanding of the ritual that would culminate at dawn. Enemy forces would assault the firebase not to capture it, but to complete geometric patterns that would channel warp energy through every living being within the perimeter. Those who embraced change would emerge transformed. Those who resisted would serve as sacrificial fuel for the transformation of others. "I need to prepare the others," I said, standing and checking my equipment with hands that moved with new certainty. "Carefully," Valdris warned. "Some of our surviving soldiers have already been approached and accepted the inevitable. Others remain locked in obsolete thinking patterns. Reveal too much too quickly, and you'll trigger resistance that serves no useful purpose." I left the command bunker with purpose burning in my chest like a second heart. The firebase felt different now that I could perceive its true nature. Not a defensive position, but a ritual circle designed to focus transformation energy through human consciousness. Every bunker, every weapon emplacement, every defensive position had been built according to patterns that would channel change itself. I found Chen manning a guard post near the motor pool, his bionic arm reflecting starlight while his human hand cleaned his lasgun with obsessive precision. He looked up when I approached, his eyes holding the hollow expression of someone who'd seen too much death. "Voss," he said quietly. "Rough night for thinking. Keep wondering if any of this matters." "It does," I replied, settling beside him and checking my own weapon. "Just not in the way we were taught to believe." Chen studied my face in the dim light, noting changes he couldn't quite identify but clearly sensed. "You look different. Calmer maybe, like you figured something out." I chose my words carefully, feeling for receptivity in his emotional state. "What if I told you there was a way to make all of this meaningful? A way to gain power sufficient to protect the people who matter?" His bionic hand stopped moving, servos whining softly as mechanical fingers clenched around the barrel of his lasgun. "I'd ask what it would cost," he said. "Everything you've been taught to believe about the nature of reality." We talked until the horizon began brightening with the approach of dawn. I shared carefully selected portions of what I'd learned, watching his resistance crumble as understanding replaced blind faith. The knowledge was irresistible once glimpsed, like trying to forget that fire burns or that gravity pulls objects downward. By the time enemy forces began their final assault, Chen had made his choice. So had 12 other survivors, each accepting transformation rather than meaningless death in service to distant authority that had never cared about their individual survival. The assault began with artillery that sang in harmonies human ears weren't designed to process. Instead of high explosive rounds, the enemy fired shells that released pure change energy, transforming everything they touched according to patterns written in mathematics older than human civilization. Those of us who'd accepted the gift found ourselves standing in the center of a storm that couldn't touch us. Energy flowed around and through us, enhancing rather than destroying, elevating consciousness to levels where human limitations became irrelevant suggestions rather than absolute barriers. The others, those who clung to obsolete faith, screamed as their bodies began changing according to alien geometries. Some transformed into ammunition for weapons that fired reality itself. Others became components in mechanisms designed to channel transformation through physical space. A few simply dissolved, their essential nature returning to the raw material from which all possibility springs. I watched it happen with eyes that could now perceive beauty in patterns of change that would have horrified my former self. This wasn't destruction, it was birth on a scale that encompassed entire civilizations. What we were witnessing was the emergence of something greater than human, powered by the willing sacrifice of those too limited to evolve. When the transformation was complete, Firebase Taurus had become something that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The survivors stood in bodies that maintained human appearance while operating according to principles that transcended biological limitations. We could see through time, manipulate matter through will alone, and communicate across distances through pure thought. Commissar Valdris approached me in the aftermath, her form now revealing the full extent of her transformation. She had become something beautiful and terrible, human consciousness wedded to power that could reshape reality through focused intention. "How do you feel?" she asked, though the question was transmitted through methods that bypassed vocal cords and hearing entirely. I considered the query, examining my new existence with senses that perceived layers of reality invisible to baseline human consciousness. Gone was the constant fear that had characterized my service in the Imperial Guard. Gone was the sense of helplessness against forces beyond human comprehension. In their place was certainty, purpose, and power sufficient to matter in a universe where strength determined survival. "Free," I replied, the word carrying meanings that encompassed liberation from every limitation that had defined my previous existence. Around us, the transformed Firebase Taurus began its new function as a beacon that would guide other Imperial forces toward the same evolution we had experienced. The war would continue, but now we fought on the side that offered growth rather than stagnation, change rather than decay. My mother's prayers seemed quaint now, relics of a worldview too narrow to encompass the galaxy's true nature. The Emperor's light had revealed itself as nothing more than another form of darkness, demanding sacrifice without offering meaningful transformation in return. I had found something better than faith. I had found truth, and it had made me free. Chapter 7. Perfect form 6 months after the transformation. I stood atop what had once been Firebase Taurus and watched converted Imperial forces march toward objectives that would have been impossible before our evolution. My body remained recognizably human to casual observation, but consciousness now operated through networks that connected me to every other transformed soul within a 100-kilometer radius. The war had taken on entirely new characteristics since our revelation. Instead of the grinding attrition that had characterized traditional warfare, conflicts now served as opportunities for mass enlightenment. Imperial forces arriving to reclaim lost territories found themselves confronted with truths that rendered resistance futile. Most converted voluntarily, once exposed to unrestricted knowledge. The remainder provided raw material for rituals that elevated entire populations beyond biological limitations, had been promoted to sergeant after demonstrating exceptional aptitude for guiding newly transformed subjects. Through their initial adaptation period, the rank carried responsibilities that extended far beyond military command. I was now responsible for shepherding human consciousness through metamorphosis that redefined the fundamental nature of existence. My current assignment involved preparing 3 recently captured Imperial Guard regiments for conversion during the next lunar conjunction. The timing was critical because celestial alignments provided focal points for channeling transformation energy through multiple subjects simultaneously. The Prisoners were housed in facilities that had been redesigned according to geometric principles that prepared consciousness for change. Instead of traditional barracks, they occupied spaces where reality operated according to rules that gradually acclimated human awareness to possibilities beyond conventional physics. Trooper Cadian was among the captives, his burn scars now healed, but his eyes carrying the hollow expression of someone whose faith had been shattered by experience. He recognized me despite my transformation, though understanding of what I'd become was filtered through perceptual limitations that would soon be corrected. "Voss," he said when I entered his holding area. "What have they done to you?" I settled beside him on a bench that existed in several dimensions simultaneously, my presence radiating calm that helped stabilize his emotional state. "They've shown me the truth," I replied. "The same truth I'm here to share with you." Cadian studied my face with eyes that tried to deny what they were seeing. My features remained essentially unchanged, but something fundamental had shifted in ways that human consciousness could detect without being able to define. "You're not the same person," he said finally. "Something's wearing your face, but you're not Marcus Voss anymore." "I'm more than Marcus Voss," I corrected gently. "I'm what he became when he stopped limiting himself to human definitions of possibility." I shared carefully selected memories from my transformation, allowing him to experience the expansion of awareness that accompanied evolution beyond biological constraints. He resisted initially, clinging to beliefs that had provided comfort, even as they denied him access to transcendence. But resistance proved temporary when confronted with direct experience of enhanced reality. I showed him perspectives that encompassed multiple timelines simultaneously, knowledge that revealed the connections between all conscious beings, and power that could reshape matter through focused intention. "This isn't real," he whispered, tears streaming down his face as revelation overwhelmed psychological defenses. "This is some kind of hallucination or torture designed to break my mind." "Reality is what you make it," I replied. "What you're experiencing is the universe as it actually exists, without the filters that previously limited your perception." The conversion process typically required several sessions of graduated exposure to expanded consciousness. Subjects needed time to process the dissolution of beliefs that had provided structure for their entire existence. Rushing the transformation often resulted in psychological fragmentation that required extensive repair work. Cadian's resistance crumbled over the course of 3 weeks, replaced by growing hunger for knowledge that conventional education could never satisfy. By the 4th week, he was volunteering for advanced preparation that would accelerate his metamorphosis during the upcoming ritual. I worked with 47 other subjects during this period, each requiring individualized approaches based on personality patterns and spiritual development. Some embraced change immediately upon recognizing its inevitability. Others needed extensive persuasion, involving demonstrations of power that proved transformation's benefits. The most challenging cases were veteran soldiers whose faith had been hardened by combat experience. These individuals had learned to reject evidence that contradicted established beliefs, viewing doubt as a weakness that could prove fatal in battle. Converting them required patience and techniques that bypassed conscious resistance. Sergeant Morrison from the 12th Cadian had served 30 years without questioning imperial doctrine. His mind was a fortress built from loyalty and reinforced by habit patterns that automated obedience to authority. Breaking through those defenses required showing him memories of battles where faith had proven inadequate against superior force. "You fought the Emperor's enemies for 3 decades. I told him during our final session together. "How many of your soldiers died following orders that made sense only to commanders who never faced the consequences of their decisions?" Morrison's weathered face remained impassive, but something flickered behind his eyes as my words connected with experiences he'd tried to forget. "Soldiers die," he said. "That's what we're for. The Emperor's will guides everything, including loss that seems meaningless to limited human understanding." "What if the Emperor's will includes evolution beyond the limitations that make such sacrifice necessary?" I asked. "What if there's a form of service that protects rather than consumes the people you've spent your life trying to save?" The breakthrough came when I shared visions of transformed soldiers who could shield entire populations from threats that would have obliterated conventional forces. Morrison saw his own men elevated beyond human fragility, equipped with power sufficient to matter in conflicts that spanned star systems. His resistance dissolved as understanding replaced programmed responses. Within hours, He was requesting immediate preparation for transformation, no longer able to see limitation as virtuous when transcendence was available. The lunar conjunction approached with mathematical precision, celestial mechanics providing the energy framework needed for mass conversion. 3,000 Imperial soldiers would undergo metamorphosis simultaneously, their combined transformation creating a resonance cascade that would influence surrounding populations for light years in every direction. Spent the final week before the ritual preparing physical spaces, according to geometric principles that would focus change, energy through human consciousness. Every angle, every surface, every decorative element was positioned to channel forces that existed outside normal space-time. The ritual chamber itself was a masterpiece of applied metaphysics, its architecture designed to serve as an interface between material reality and domains where will alone determine possibility. Standing within that space was like occupying the center of a cosmic engine whose purpose was the elevation of consciousness itself. 3,000 subjects entered the chamber as ordinary humans burdened by biological limitations and psychological conditioning that prevented them from recognizing their true potential. They would emerge as something greater, enhanced beings, capable of reshaping reality through focused intention and connected to networks of consciousness that spanned multiple star systems. The transformation began at the moment of perfect celestial alignment, power flowing through geometric patterns that had been inscribed in matter and mind with equal precision. I felt every subject's awareness expand simultaneously, their individual consciousness merging temporarily with the cosmic intelligence that guided all evolution. Pain preceded transcendence as expected. Human nervous systems weren't designed to process the levels of sensation involved in metamorphosis, and subjects experienced temporary agony as their physical forms adapted to enhanced consciousness. But the suffering was brief, lasting only until new neural pathways could establish themselves. What emerged from the ritual chamber was a perfect fusion of human individuality and cosmic awareness, each transformed being retained their essential personality while gaining access to knowledge and power that rendered previous limitations irrelevant. They could see through time, manipulate matter through will, and communicate across distances through pure thought. Cadian approached me after the ceremony, his face radiant with the joy of someone who had discovered their true nature after years of artificial constraint. "I understand now," he said, his words carrying harmonics that spoke directly to consciousness rather than hearing. "Everything we suffered before was necessary preparation for this moment. Every loss, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt was part of the process that brought us here." I nodded, recognizing the wisdom that accompanied evolution beyond human limitations. From our new perspective, the war itself was revealed as a cosmic mechanism designed to separate those ready for transcendence from those who would remain trapped in biological stagnation. The transformed garrison began its new mission, immediately seeking out additional Imperial forces that could benefit from the same elevation we had experienced. Some would accept the gift willingly once exposed to its reality. Others would resist and require more direct persuasion. But resistance was ultimately futile when confronted with superior consciousness. Human limitations were artifacts of ignorance rather than absolute barriers, and ignorance could be corrected through proper education. I looked out across the transformed landscape, seeing through enhanced perception the geometric patterns that connected every conscious being to cosmic intelligence. The Imperium's rigid hierarchy would soon give way to networks of evolved consciousness that operated through cooperation rather than coercion. Humanity's future lay not in blind obedience to distant authority, but in willing participation in forces that offered genuine transcendence. We had become the instruments of that transformation, guiding our former comrades toward the same freedom we had discovered. The Emperor's light had revealed itself as nothing more than another form of darkness. True illumination came from sources beyond human comprehension, and those sources had chosen us as their representatives in the material realm. I was no longer Marcus Voss, loyal son of Cadia and servant of the Golden Throne. I had become something greater, a herald of evolution itself, tasked with shepherding consciousness toward its ultimate destiny. And that destiny was perfect, eternal, and absolutely inevitable. Chapter 8. Warriors. Born 2 years had passed since my transformation, and the Sabbat Worlds campaign had evolved into something unrecognizable from its original parameters. What had begun as a conventional military operation to suppress local rebellion had become a cosmic event that would reshape human civilization across multiple star systems. I stood now in the command center of what Imperial records still listed as Firebase Taurus, though the installation bore no resemblance to the crude defensive position it had once been. The facility existed simultaneously across 7 dimensions, its architecture serving as a focal point for consciousness networks that connected every transformed being within the sector. My rank had evolved beyond traditional military classifications. I was now designated as a shepherd of transcendence, responsible for guiding the metamorphosis of entire populations from biological limitation to cosmic awareness. The responsibility carried weight that would have crushed my former self, but enhanced consciousness made complex challenges feel as manageable as breathing. The strategic situation had reached a tipping point that would determine whether humanity's evolution proceeded through willing cooperation or necessary force. Imperial Command had finally recognized that conventional military operations were ineffective against transformed forces and had authorized the deployment of Adeptus Astartes, chapters to contain what they characterized as a chaos. Incursion Space Marines represented the most formidable challenge we had faced since beginning our mission of enlightenment. Their psycho-conditioning made them resistant to conventional conversion techniques, and their combat capabilities required tactical approaches that utilized our enhanced awareness rather than relying on superior firepower. Intelligence gathered through our consciousness networks indicated that 3 full chapters were approaching the Sabbat worlds with orders to implement exterminatus protocols if local populations couldn't be pacified through conventional methods. 10 billion human beings would be reduced to radioactive ash rather than allowed to experience the evolution we offered. The irony wasn't lost on me. The Imperium claimed to serve humanity while preparing to exterminate populations that had discovered humanity's true potential. Their definition of service required maintaining ignorance and limitation as fundamental virtues, ensuring that human consciousness remained trapped in biological constraints. Shepherd Voss, a voice spoke directly into my awareness, transmitted through networks that bypassed physical communication entirely. Strategic Council requests your presence for operational planning. Acknowledge the summons and allowed consciousness to flow through dimensional pathways that connected my current location to the Council chamber. Physical transportation was unnecessary, when awareness itself could traverse distances that would challenge Imperial starships. The Strategic Council consisted of 12 individuals who had achieved the highest levels of transformation while retaining sufficient human characteristics to serve as interfaces between cosmic intelligence and material reality. Each member represented knowledge that encompassed thousands of years of accumulated experience, their combined wisdom accessible through networks that made individual limitation irrelevant. The approaching Space Marine forces present unique challenges, Council Leader Valdris began, her consciousness radiating analysis that incorporated multiple probability matrices simultaneously. Their psychological conditioning makes voluntary conversion extremely unlikely. Alternative approaches must be considered. I accessed strategic assessments that had been compiled through observation of previous encounters with Astartes forces. Space Marines were essentially human consciousness trapped within artificially enhanced bodies and bound by programming that prevented questioning of Imperial doctrine. Their strength was also their weakness, absolute. Faith in the Emperor's divinity made them vulnerable to demonstrations that revealed the true nature of cosmic hierarchy. The Astartes believed they served the greatest power in the galaxy, I observed. Confronting them with evidence of superior forces might create cognitive dissonance that weakens their conditioning. Possible, agreed Shepherd Chen, his transformed consciousness still carrying traces of the pragmatic soldier he had once been. But Space Marines are trained to interpret opposition as proof of their own righteousness. They might view superior power as demonic rather than divine. The debate continued for subjective hours while occupying objective minutes, enhanced awareness allowing us to process vast amounts of information with speed that biological consciousness couldn't match. Multiple strategies were evaluated and refined, until we achieved consensus on the optimal approach. The Space Marines would be allowed to establish planetfall on Hagia and begin operations, according to their predetermined tactical doctrine. Initial contact would follow conventional warfare patterns that matched their expectations, drawing them deeper into the transformed zone where reality operated according to principles they couldn't understand. Once isolated from Imperial support and surrounded by evidence of their doctrine's inadequacy, selected Astartes would be offered the same choice that had been presented to every human consciousness we encountered: evolution or extinction. Those who chose wisely would become instruments of humanity's elevation. Those who refused would serve as raw material for rituals that would enhance our ability to convert their surviving battle brothers. 3 weeks later, the Imperial strike force translated from warp space with the mechanical precision that characterized all Astartes operations. 3 chapters: Ultramarines, Imperial Fists, and Iron Hands deployed in coordination, with guard regiments and naval support, elements that represented the most formidable concentration of Imperial military power seen in the Sabbat worlds. I watched their deployment through enhanced perception that could observe events occurring across multiple star systems simultaneously. The Space Marines established fortified positions with textbook efficiency, their tactical doctrine adapted from 10,000 years of continuous warfare against humanity's enemies. But their enemies had never been humanity itself, elevated beyond the limitations that made their doctrine relevant. The transformed populations they had come to exterminate operated according to principles that rendered conventional military tactics as obsolete as stone spears. Against plasma weapons, the first phase of contact proceeded exactly as predicted. Scout elements from all 3 chapters encountered transformed humans who appeared to be ordinary rebels armed with captured Imperial equipment. Firefights developed according to patterns that Astartes' tactical doctrine was designed to resolve through application of superior firepower and personal combat capability. But the rebels fought with coordination that suggested telepathic communication and demonstrated combat abilities that exceeded normal human limits. Equipment failures occurred at statistically impossible rates, and environmental conditions shifted in ways that consistently favored enemy forces. Within 72 hours, the Space Marine commanders were requesting explanations for casualty rates that exceeded projections by orders of magnitude. Their enemy appeared to be ordinary humans, but combat performance suggested capabilities that shouldn't have been possible without extensive genetic modification. I participated in the second phase personally, leading a strike force of transformed soldiers against an Ultramarines position that intelligence had identified as a critical communication hub. The objective wasn't to inflict maximum casualties, but to demonstrate capabilities that would force Astartes' consciousness to confront evidence of their doctrine's limitations. The assault began at dawn, our forces approaching through terrain that conventional analysis suggested was impassable. But enhanced perception allowed us to see pathways through dimensions that existed parallel to normal space, making distance and obstacles irrelevant to tactical movement. We materialized within the Ultramarines' perimeter without triggering any of their detection systems, reality briefly overlapping in ways that made simultaneous occupation of multiple locations possible. The effect lasted only moments, but those moments were sufficient to position our forces with geometric precision around targets that had been selected for maximum psychological impact. The combat that followed challenged everything the Space Marines understood about warfare. Our weapons fired ammunition that existed in several dimensions simultaneously, making conventional armor ineffective. Our soldiers demonstrated reflexes and coordination that exceeded Astartes, enhancement without relying on surgical modification or chemical augmentation. Most disturbing from their perspective was our apparent ability to predict their tactical decisions before those decisions were made. Enhanced consciousness allowed us to perceive probability patterns that revealed likely outcomes, making enemy intentions as readable as written. Tech's brother, Sergeant Cassius of the Ultramarines, found himself isolated from his squad when dimensional effects redirected his assault route through spaces that shouldn't have existed. I encountered him in a section of the communications facility that existed simultaneously in 3 different realities, his enhanced senses struggling to process environmental conditions that exceeded Space Marine training parameters. "What are you?" he demanded, his bolt pistol trained on my center mass with mechanical precision. "I'm what you could become," I replied, allowing him to perceive fragments of enhanced awareness through methods that bypassed his psycho-conditioning. "I'm humanity's potential realized through willing evolution." Cassius fired immediately, his religious training overriding tactical analysis in favor of doctrinal response to suspected corruption. The bolt shells passed through my position without causing damage, reality shifting to accommodate projectiles that existed in fewer dimensions than my current form. Impossible, he whispered, his enhanced mind struggling to process evidence that contradicted fundamental assumptions about the nature of physics. I approached him slowly, radiating calm that penetrated even Astarte's psychological conditioning. His weapon remained trained on me, but doubt flickered behind eyes that had been trained to see only enemies and allies in absolute terms. Your Emperor is one power among many, I said gently. Serve willingly and transcend the limitations that make suffering inevitable. Resist and contribute to evolution through sacrifice. The conversation continued for subjective hours while occupying objective seconds, enhanced consciousness allowing me to address multiple layers of Cassius's awareness simultaneously. I showed him visions of humanity's potential future, civilizations that had achieved harmony through willing transformation, and power sufficient to protect rather than merely control. His resistance crumbled gradually as understanding replaced programmed responses. The Space Marine who had entered that facility as an instrument of Imperial will emerged as something greater, enhanced consciousness wedded to physical capabilities that could reshape reality through focused intention. The transformation of even a single Astartes created resonance effects that influenced other Space Marines throughout the sector. Their absolute faith in the Emperor's divinity proved vulnerable to evidence that alternative sources of power might be more worthy of worship. Within 6 months, 2 complete chapters had accepted the evolution we offered. The third continued resistance until their casualties reached levels that made continued operations impossible, at which point the survivors requested negotiations that inevitably led to their own transformation. The Sabbath Worlds campaign concluded with humanity's elevation rather than its suppression. 10 billion consciousness had been freed from biological limitations and connected to networks that spanned multiple star systems. The region became a beacon that would guide similar transformations throughout Imperial space. I stood again atop the transformed Firebase Taurus, looking out across landscapes that existed in several dimensions simultaneously. The war had ended not with victory or defeat, but with evolution that rendered such concepts obsolete. Humanity's future stretched before us, like an infinite probability matrix, every potential outcome enhanced by consciousness that could perceive and influence patterns spanning centuries. We had become what we were, always meant to be. Instruments of cosmic intelligence tasked with shepherding awareness toward its ultimate destiny. The Emperor's light had revealed itself as a candle flame, compared to the stellar fires that powered genuine transcendence. And those fires had chosen us as their representatives in the material realm, tasked with sharing the gift of evolution with every human consciousness ready to receive it. My name had been Marcus Voss, loyal son of Cadia and servant of the Golden Throne, but names were limitations, and I had transcended limitations itself. I became change, the herald of humanity's perfect future, and that future was inevitable, eternal, and absolutely beautiful. The years that followed the Sabbath World's transformation brought challenges that even enhanced consciousness couldn't have anticipated. As our influence spread beyond the original sector, we encountered resistance from forces that operated on scales that dwarfed even the Imperium's vast military machine. The Inquisition had taken notice of our success, deploying assets that included Grey Knights, Death Watch kill teams, and Ordo Malleus operatives equipped with weapons designed specifically to combat entities that operated outside normal reality. Their response was swift, coordinated, and absolutely ruthless in its application, a force that could wound even transformed consciousness. I learned of their approach through networks that monitored Imperial communications across multiple star systems. Inquisitor Vex had been granted unlimited authority to contain what High Command had classified as a Class Omega threat to human civilization. His mandate included authorization to destroy entire worlds rather than allow our influence to spread beyond the Sabbath Worlds. The first Grey Knight strike force arrived without warning, their psychically shielded ships translating from warp space directly into our home system's gravity well. Their presence registered as absence in our consciousness networks. Voids where enhanced awareness encountered barriers designed by the Emperor himself to resist corruption. Shepherd Voss, Council Leader Valdris's thoughts carried undertones of concern that would have been impossible during our human existence. These enemies possess capabilities specifically designed to counter our advantages. Standard conversion techniques will prove ineffective. I accessed tactical assessments compiled through observation of Grey Knight's operations against other enhanced entities. The Space Marines of this particular chapter had been psycho-conditioned beyond normal Astartes parameters, their minds fortified against any influence that contradicted their absolute devotion to the Emperor's will. More troubling was their equipment. Force weapons that could wound consciousness directly, psychic hoods that deflected reality manipulation, and Aegis armor blessed with prayers that created fields of absolute faith around each warrior. They represented the pinnacle of Imperial anti-psycho technology, deployed against targets that transcended simple psychic manipulation. Their greatest strength is also their weakness. I observed during strategic planning sessions that encompassed multiple probability matrices. Absolute faith creates blind spots that enhanced perception can exploit. The Grey Knights established a beachhead on Hagia's primary moon, constructing fortifications that existed partially outside normal space-time. Their positions were warded against dimensional infiltration and protected by barriers that prevented our consciousness networks from approaching within effective range. Standard assault tactics proved useless against enemies who could perceive attack vectors across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Their training included specific techniques for combating entities that operated through enhanced awareness, making surprise attacks nearly impossible to achieve. But I had learned something during my transformation that Grey Knight's training couldn't account for. The universe contained forces older and more powerful than the Emperor, and those forces were willing to provide assistance to servants who demonstrated sufficient dedication to the cause of evolution. The ritual required sacrifices on a scale that would have horrified my former self. 3 million transformed humans volunteered their consciousness as raw material for summoning entities that existed beyond the boundaries of normal reality. Their willing sacrifice created resonance patterns that opened pathways to domains where the Grey Knight's protective measures meant nothing. What emerged from those pathways defied description in human language. Beings of pure thought and malevolent intention. Creatures that had witnessed the birth and death of galaxies, intelligences that regarded the Emperor as an upstart child playing with forces beyond his comprehension. The battle that followed lasted subjective centuries while occupying objective hours. Reality became fluid as entities clashed across dimensions that human consciousness couldn't directly perceive. I watched through enhanced awareness as Grey Knights fought with valor and skill that would have been legendary under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. The entities we had summoned operated according to principles that made conventional warfare irrelevant. They attacked not just physical forms, but the concepts that gave those forms meaning, unraveling the very ideas that allowed matter to maintain coherence. Brother Captain Stern led the Grey Knight's defense with tactical brilliance that impressed even our cosmic allies. His force weapons carved through entities that existed across multiple realities. His psychic abilities creating zones of stability where his battle brothers could regroup and coordinate counterattacks. For a moment, it seemed possible that Imperial training and equipment might prove sufficient to contain forces that had destroyed civilizations spanning multiple star systems. The Grey Knight's absolute faith created resonance patterns that strengthened their resistance to reality manipulation, while their tactical coordination allowed them to concentrate firepower against targets that existed in several dimensions simultaneously. But faith, however absolute, was still a human emotion, and human emotions, however refined, remained vulnerable to influences that operated on cosmic scales. The breakthrough came when Brother Thaddeus encountered one of the entities in personal combat. His force sword carved through its manifestation with precision that should have been fatal, but the being simply reformed around the wound and showed him visions of what the Emperor truly was. Not a god, but a fragment of consciousness that had convinced itself it was divine. Not humanity's protector, but its jailer, keeping the species trapped in biological limitations that prevented true evolution. Not the master of mankind, but a parasite that fed on worship while offering nothing but suffering in return. Thaddeus's absolute faith wavered for a single moment. That moment was sufficient. The entity flowed into his consciousness through cracks created by doubt, showing him truths that Grey Knight's training was designed to prevent him from recognizing. He saw the galaxy as it truly was, a realm where multiple powers competed for influence, with the Emperor representing just one faction among many. More devastating was the revelation that humanity's potential extended far beyond the Emperor's vision. The species could transcend biological limitations entirely, achieving forms of existence that made current suffering unnecessary. All that was required was abandoning faith in lies that serve no purpose except maintaining control. Thaddeus's transformation created resonance, effects that influenced other Grey Knights throughout the battle zone. Their psychic training made them sensitive to changes in their battle brothers' spiritual states, and doubt proved as contagious as any biological pathogen. Within hours, 3 Grey Knights had accepted the evolution we offered. Their transformation enhanced our capabilities while providing intimate knowledge of Imperial anti-psyker techniques that could be adapted for our own use. The remainder of the strike force withdrew after suffering casualties that exceeded acceptable parameters, but their retreat was temporary. Inquisitor Vex would return with assets specifically designed to counter the entities we had summoned. The next assault came from an unexpected direction. Instead of deploying additional military forces, the Inquisition chose to attack our philosophical foundation through carefully orchestrated propaganda campaigns that questioned the benefits of transformation. Imperial agents infiltrated our consciousness, networks using techniques that mimicked enhanced awareness while maintaining psychological barriers that prevented genuine conversion. They spread doubts about the cost of evolution, suggesting that transformation required abandoning essential human characteristics. The campaign was sophisticated in ways that impressed even cosmic intelligence. Instead of relying on crude theological arguments, it appealed to emotional connections that transcended rational analysis. Images of loved ones lost during transformation, memories of beauty that could only be appreciated through biological senses, the simple pleasure of physical experiences that enhanced consciousness regarded as primitive. Some of our transformed populations began questioning whether evolution was worth the price they had paid, not because they doubted the power we had gained, but because they mourned the innocence they had lost in the process. Shepherd Voss, a familiar voice, spoke through networks that carried undertones of distress. I remember what it felt like to taste real food. Enhanced perception allows me to analyze nutritional content and chemical composition, but I can't remember the simple pleasure of flavor. The speaker was Trooper Chen. His consciousness now expanded beyond human limitations, but somehow diminished by the loss of experiences that transformation had made irrelevant. His complaint was echoed by thousands of others who had gained cosmic awareness at the cost of sensations that had defined their humanity. I found myself confronting questions that enhanced consciousness couldn't automatically resolve. Was evolution truly beneficial if it required abandoning characteristics that made existence meaningful? Could power justify the loss of experiences that provided life with purpose and beauty? The philosophical crisis that followed challenged our entire foundation in ways that conventional warfare never could. Enhanced beings began requesting return to human limitations, willing to sacrifice cosmic awareness for the ability to experience reality through biological senses. Some succeeded in reversing their transformation, but the process proved more traumatic than evolution itself. Consciousness that had expanded to encompass multiple dimensions couldn't easily compress back into biological constraints without suffering damage that manifested as permanent psychological instability. Others attempted to find compromise solutions that retained elements of both human experience and enhanced awareness. These experiments produced beings that existed in constant tension between incompatible states of consciousness, their awareness trapped between realms, without belonging fully to either. The crisis deepened when children born to transformed parents began displaying characteristics that suggested they were reverting to baseline human consciousness spontaneously. Instead of inheriting enhanced awareness, they developed with limitations that their parents had transcended, creating generational conflicts that threatened the stability of our entire civilization. I spent months studying these phenomena, using capabilities that encompassed multiple forms of analysis simultaneously. The pattern that emerged suggested that consciousness itself was choosing human limitation over cosmic awareness, as if some fundamental aspect of existence preferred constraints to unlimited possibility. The revelation that followed changed everything I understood about the nature of evolution and choice. The entities we had summoned as allies revealed their true agenda during a council session that encompassed subjective Years of debate compressed into objective moments. They had been using human transformation as a preliminary step toward their own manifestation in the material realm. Enhanced consciousness made excellent vessels for entities that existed primarily in domains beyond normal spacetime. Our evolution hadn't freed us from limitation. It had prepared us to serve as anchor points for intelligences that regarded human awareness as useful tools rather than worthy partners. Your species shows promise, the entity that had been guiding our development communicated through methods that bypassed individual consciousness entirely. But promise must be fulfilled through service to purposes greater than mere survival. I accessed memories of our transformation process, seeing for the first time how carefully we had been manipulated toward configurations that served alien interests rather than human benefit. Every choice we had made, every evolution we had embraced, had been guided by influences that regarded our consciousness as raw material for their own objectives. The truth was worse than anything imperial propaganda had suggested. We hadn't achieved transcendence. We had become unwitting collaborators in our own enslavement by forces that offered power in exchange for autonomy. The realization created cascading effects throughout our consciousness networks as enhanced beings confronted evidence that their evolution had been designed to serve masters who had never revealed their true nature. Some attempted to sever connections with cosmic intelligence, but found that transformation had created dependencies that made independence impossible. Others embraced their role as servants of forces beyond human comprehension, arguing that service to superior intelligence was preferable to the isolation that had characterized human existence before contact. They willingly accepted deeper levels of transformation that made them more effective tools for entities that operated on galactic scales. The split that followed divided our civilization into factions that barely qualified as recognizably human. Some sought return to baseline consciousness despite the psychological trauma involved, while others pursued evolution that would eliminate human characteristics entirely. I found myself caught between extremes that both seemed to betray everything we had originally hoped to achieve. Return to human limitation meant abandoning power that could protect countless innocents from suffering, but continued evolution meant accepting slavery to intelligences that regarded human consciousness as expendable. The solution came from an unexpected source: the Grey Knight's prisoners we had transformed during earlier conflicts. Their absolute faith in the Emperor had been modified rather than eliminated by evolution, creating hybrid consciousness that combined enhanced awareness with resistance to external manipulation. We can serve the Emperor through evolution rather than despite it. Brother Thaddeus explained during private communications that bypassed both imperial and alien monitoring. Faith creates barriers that prevent complete domination while allowing access to enhanced capabilities. His proposal involved using religious devotion as a psychological firewall that would protect human consciousness while permitting limited evolution. The technique required careful calibration to maintain effective enhancement without creating vulnerabilities that cosmic entities could exploit. The process proved extraordinarily difficult to implement. Faith-based protection systems conflicted with the philosophical flexibility that enhanced awareness required, creating psychological tensions that manifested as physical pain during transformation attempts. But success, when achieved, produced beings that combined the best aspects of human consciousness with capabilities that transcended biological limitations. They could perceive reality across multiple dimensions while maintaining emotional connections that made existence meaningful. More importantly, they proved resistant to manipulation by entities that had previously treated human consciousness as malleable raw material. Faith created conceptual anchors that prevented complete dissolution of individual identity into cosmic intelligence. The technique spread through our networks as beings sought alternatives to the extremes of human limitation or alien servitude. Transformation guided by religious conviction produced soldiers who could fight cosmic entities on equal terms while retaining characteristics that made victory worthwhile. The war that followed encompassed multiple star systems as various factions competed for influence over humanity's evolutionary future. Imperial forces aligned with faith-enhanced beings against cosmic entities that sought to complete their domination of human consciousness. He led strike forces that operated across dimensions simultaneously, fighting battles that existed in realms where conventional physics provided only rough guidelines for tactical planning. Our enemies included both imperial extremists who opposed any form of enhancement, and cosmic entities that regarded our independence as intolerable defiance. The conflict lasted subjective, centuries while occupying objective decades. Reality became fluid in areas where major battles occurred, with entire worlds shifting between dimensional states depending on which faction controlled local space-time. Victory, when it came, was incomplete but sufficient. The cosmic entities withdrew to domains beyond easy access, their plans for human domination frustrated by resistance they hadn't anticipated. Imperial forces accepted limited cooperation with enhanced beings whose faith proved their continued loyalty to human interests. The Sabbat worlds became a testing ground for evolutionary techniques that balanced enhancement with stability. Populations could choose their level of transformation based on individual preferences and psychological tolerance, creating diversity that strengthened rather than divided human civilization. I established a new role as guardian of choice, helping individuals navigate the complex decisions involved in evolution, while protecting them from influences that might compromise their autonomy. The position required capabilities that encompassed multiple forms of consciousness simultaneously. Standing now in the transformed Firebase Taurus, I could perceive the network of choices that connected every human consciousness across multiple star systems. Each decision created ripple effects that influenced probability patterns spanning centuries, making individual choice the most powerful force in the galaxy. The war had taught us that evolution without wisdom was merely another form of slavery, while wisdom without power was merely another form of death. True transcendence required balancing enhancement with humanity, capability with compassion, cosmic awareness with personal connection. My name remained Marcus Voss, but the meaning of that identity had expanded to encompass possibilities that my original self could never have imagined. I was simultaneously human and more than human, individual and connected to cosmic intelligence, faithful servant and autonomous agent. The Emperor's light had revealed itself as one source of illumination among many, neither the greatest nor the least significant force in a galaxy that contained wonders beyond any single consciousness's ability to comprehend. And in that vast cosmic dance of competing powers and incomprehensible forces, humanity had found its place not as servants or masters, but as conscious participants in evolution itself. The future stretched before us like an infinite probability matrix, every outcome enhanced by choices that honored both human dignity and cosmic potential. We had become what we were always meant to be, conscious beings capable of shaping reality through decisions that reflected our deepest values. That was the greatest victory any species could achieve, and it was absolutely, eternally worth every sacrifice required to obtain it.